My name's Kurt Behrens. I'm president of the Issachar Fund, and we are proud to support this conversation on Luke Bretherton's book, Political Theology, Christ in the Common Life. I was going to start with a subtitle. How's that? Political Theology and the Case for Democracy. Just a quick word. The Issachar Fund is a private operating foundation in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And if you were to go to our website, this would be the banner question or quote. Tell me how you are searching, and I will tell you what you are searching for. Ludwig Wittgenstein. And then after that, we have two foundational questions, which questions are open to change, and they will over time. The first is, how do we seek and know what is true and real? And the second, is there a best or right or true way to live? And for those of you who have read Cavanaugh's book on the Stoics, you'll know where we cheerfully pilfered that. We believe that who we are as people shapes the kinds of questions we ask and even influences the kind of answers we come up with. And that is one thing that drew us to Luke's work. Luke has a passion not just for ideas, but for how ideas become incarnate in life and the virtues that it takes to sustain the kind of conversation we need in political life today. And it doesn't take much to look around in North America, but even in the UK, to see that we are sorely in need of a conversation by well-formed people to have the kind of conversation over well-formed ideas. And that's what this conversation is about. I want to introduce briefly Greg Jones. Greg is the new dean here at Duke Divinity, though he is also the old dean here at Duke Divinity. And if you go into Duke Divinity, you can see a portrait of Greg, which usually is a sign of what a dead dean looks like. But Greg is not dead. He is alive and well and is here to moderate the conversation. I will turn it over to Greg.
Thanks, Kurt. I think it is a great joy to welcome you all to Duke Divinity School and Duke University for this event and conversation about matters that matter quite significantly around how we think about democracy, common life, and reweaving social fabric that around the world and in local communities now seems to be fraying at alarming rates. And so the questions and the conversation could not be more urgent or important. We have a bit of a different evening on tap for us than anticipated because Professor Miroslav Volf, who was initially going to give the keynote address, is delayed somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Raleigh-Durham. We anticipate that he will be arriving at some point this evening, but not in time for this evening's conversation. And so we will be engaging in a different kind of format. I'm going to invite soon Luke Bretherton to offer some initial remarks. And then what we had anticipated was that Melissa Snarr of Vanderbilt University and Vanderbilt Divinity School and Patrick Smith of Duke Divinity School would be offering responses to Professor Bretherton based on his book. I'll then ask Luke to respond to Melissa and Patrick. And then we have, on short notice, enlisted two other colleagues and good friends to serve on a panel. They had all of about 45 minutes advance notice, but we're grateful that Professor Bill Cavanaugh and Professor Sarah Coakley have offered to join the conversation, which I will moderate and try to rein in when it gets carried away. So that will be the format. I think it'll be a very stimulating evening. The focus, as Kurt suggested, around this gathering is Professor Bretherton's book, Christ and the Common Life. I think most of you who are here know of Luke. He is a colleague and professor of theological ethics here at Duke. You'll quickly learn, though, that he is not a native American Southerner. From his accent, he joined us after having been on the faculty at King's London and is now a leader both in the Divinity School and at Duke. He has published several books prior to Christ and the Common Life, one of which won the Michael Ramsey Award And so he has been on a very significant trajectory, both of serious scholarship and also attentive to public engagement and the importance of Christian witness and its impact. It's a brilliant book with lots of promise for conversation and impact in terms of how we envision Christian life and Christian witness here in the 21st century. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Luke Bretherton to the stage?
Thank you. So it's an enormous delight and honor to be here, and lovely to see so many friends and colleagues and former students and current students, and a huge thank you to Bill and Sarah for stepping in at the last minute, but also to Patrick and Melissa for what will be, I'm sure, I'll say thank you now rather than later, so the roasting to come. But just wanted to say some other thank yous also to Issachar. Really, it's been a delight to work with them. We are slightly running a pattern. I ran an event in London where Stanley, my wonderful colleague, has next door office, was supposed to be the keynote and had to go into hospital. So it feels like there's a kind of thing here where I run an event and the keynote doesn't show up. So not quite sure that I'm supposed to learn from that, if anything at all. And also want to thank Greg and the Divinity School generally for their support and being such a great home for the kind of intellectual work that I've been able to do here, and the way in which the Divinity School marries that deep commitment to the best of theological scholarship and service to the church. And these are rare spaces, and so I want to honour that and thank you for stewarding that. Also, delight to have my family here, Caroline and Gabriel and Isaac. I don't know where Gabriel is, he's disappeared off. Oh, there it is. So yes, just wonderful. They weren't able to be there in London. It's particularly lovely to have Caroline here. The book itself is dedicated to her brother, Michael, who died very tragically a few years ago. Someone I love very much, and very much his spirit is, I think, embodied in the book. And he was someone who really did foster and generate a common life in a rich and nourishing way all around him. And so I just want to lift him up, his memory up in this public way. In switching into some reflections, as you can imagine, I had a whole response to Miroslav worked out. So this is kind of put together at the last minute, but I thought I'd say something about the book. So we had some sense of what we're talking about. Unlike many, I don't presume, it's a big book, it's a lot to get through. I'm sure it works very well as a doorstop. But if you ever need something to kind of while away the hours, there are things to learn in it. But I'll give you some sense of what's there. So the book sets out a vision for really a politics born out of listening. Listening, I think, should be, it often isn't, but should be the most basic act, particularly for Christians and Jews. In Deuteronomy 6, we're told, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." This, of course, is the basis of the Shema, which is the prayer you should say day and night as a faithful Jewish person, and for the really faithful is the last words of your dying breath. And I think it's echoed in Romans 10:17. So faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. So the Shema and Romans 10 teaches us that I think listening is a sacred act, and it's one that orientates us rightly to God and our neighbors. And listening as a sacred act, I think, runs counter to deep currents in our culture. The modern sensibility is that we make the world, that we construct reality in our image, reshaping nature and our relations with others to suit our needs, our choices, our desires. By contrast, listening orientates me to a world I didn't make, I don't control, I'm not in charge of, I can only receive as a gift. By listening first, we ensure somehow that we discern the truth of the world and can act appropriately in response to it. So at its most basic then, if we're listening to others, we're not killing or coercing them. If we're listening, we're not pretending to be in control or trying to determine the outcome before the conversation even begins. Rather, we're trusting that the wisdom is to be found not just amongst academics like me or the credentialed experts, not just amongst those I understand or even like, but actually even amongst those I don't like or find strange or scandalous or threatening. And so I think in listening, we make a very, very basic claim. In listening to someone, we say, you matter, you have value. And the book emerges out of my experiences from certain kinds of grassroots democratic politics that provide a means through which we learn to listen and thereby discover a shared world of meaning and action with others not like us. But when I talk about democratic politics, I'm not referring to party politics or what takes place in DC. I'm referring to a set of relational practices that foster forms of disciplined and active listening and a way we can discover with and for others just and generous forms of common life. I think listening is also a way in which we can address head-on the reality of sin in politics, of sinful power relations. That is, how are certain forms of knowledge and action legitimized and others marginalized to the benefit of some and to the detriment of others. Now, the lesson to be learned from taking sin seriously in relation to politics is not that all moral claims in politics are hypocrisy, or that all interpretive frameworks are mere ideology. Our public life desperately needs more morality, I think, and better ways of understanding the world. The lesson is rather that the first step to a politics that's more moral and more truthful is realizing we are not. The next step is to take responsibility for our sinfulness and establish the representation of other interests and voices in any decision-making process. We can thereby constructively address the contested nature of knowledge and the shared judgments we make. But to do so involves humility. It involves the humility to know that despite my expertise, despite my academic credentials, despite the zeal and zealotry of my commitments to the truth and to justice, I might not be right. I might not know everything. I might not have a monopoly on wisdom. So where is wisdom to be found? Well, I wish I could say it was found in the hallowed halls of places like Duke. It sometimes is, but not often. And I wish I could say it was found in the hallowed halls of the church. It sometimes is, but often it isn't. If we turn to Scripture, from Exodus through to Christ's shout of dereliction, it exhorts us to listen to the poor and to the oppressed, those on the underside of history. The kind of cries that you hear when you listen there are the kinds of speech that don't take the form of finely honed arguments that you read in the opinion pages of the New York Times. They take the form of passionate laments, of impatient invective, of cries of despair, all of which, I think, are vital forms of democratic communication. And as with the Hebrew prophets and the Psalms, personal lament and grief-filled cries give birth to public speech and action that contest an unjust status quo. But the kind of common life, virtuous and democratic politics I argue for doesn't only involve listening. It is an account of politics, and so requires ways and means of organizing and reorganizing power. That is to say, it requires action. And action requires assembly. It requires forming a people who can act with and for others and over and against that which corrupts or oppresses them. Both Christianity and democracy share this insight. Democratic politics builds on the contention that it's the best way to prevent the subordination of human flourishing and the mutually responsible social relationships to the demands of either the state or the market is not the law, is not a seminar room of exchanging ideas, but collective power born out of associating for common action. And to build and sustain relational power takes discipline and loyalty. Loyalty or faithfulness is vital to both developing any kind of common life and to the shared action necessary for dismantling corrupt or oppressive structures. Faithfulness denotes reliability, commitment, trustworthiness. Without it, promises are broken, relations of trust dissolve, and so the ability to act together evaporates. In short, democracy, to be democratic, needs the practice of virtue. In the American and British context, forms of popular common action emerged within such movements as the abolitionist movement, the Chartists, the suffragists, the temperance movement, and the civil rights movement. These were aligned and had a symbiotic relationship with popular religion. What these movements represent is the assertion of the priority of faithful or covenantal forms of social relationships and the trust and solidarity such relations generate. By prioritizing society over the state and market, covenantal forms of association, i.e. those based not on contracts, but on promises and faithfulness, are vital to upholding common values and a common life, and against their instrumentalization or destruction by state and economic processes. As with democracy, so with the church. As I argue in the book, assembly is the basis of the people of God. Through assembly, the church can bear witness. And this witness is not that of a neutral expert or commentator. It's the witness of the martyrs, those whose way of life should taste, sound, smell, and feel like justice and love through meals eaten together, in broken bodies cared for, in corruption exposed, and in the new institutions built that serve real needs. Truth is not something to be read about. It's something to be lived and participated in. In the book, I try to set out how and why a politics born out of listening to God and to our neighbors is vital for the health and integrity of both Christianity and democracy. My contention is that if we're to assemble more faithful, hopeful, and loving people capable of embodying a just and loving common life in difficult times, then what we need is more organizers and local leaders in churches and other faith communities building relational power together and cultivating the common life with others through everyday patterns of speech and action. To combat the lies and injustice that engulf and distort our contemporary public life, it is communities living in truth with one another through practices of justice and love in the ordinariness and intimacies of their life that are needed. My hope is that the book serves as an encouragement to undertake this difficult and time-consuming and often stressful but deeply nourishing work. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Baptist. I gotta have a little bit of something here. I am thankful to be part of the celebration of the book launch of Luke's magisterial Christ in the Common Life. My charge tonight was to talk about how this book speaks to my own work. And I want to start my appreciation from maybe a slightly different vantage point, a pedagogical perspective. I regularly teach a course called Religion and Social Movements. I think Luke teaches a community organizing course that has some resonance, where most of my students are immersed in a social change organization of their choosing for an entire semester. We certainly read different theories and theologies of social change, including Luke's previous book, and study various movements. But at the heart of the course is the students' own ethnographic observations of their organization. And by the end of the term, most students are wrestling with how to hold together their righteous commitment to a cause. I teach at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where righteous causes are very important to us. How to hold together their righteous commitment to a cause and their appreciation of their placement with the complex internal dynamics of their organization, the frustrations of coalitional politics, and proximate change. This messiness must become the sandbox for their theological reflection. One of the things I appreciate deeply about Luke's Christ in the Common Life is that it is ethnographically haunted. This influences its definition and starting point for politics, his read of associational landscapes, and his theological argumentation. The political theology he constructs regularly loops back to the creativity and complexity of actual political associations. This approach disrupts monistic understandings of the political realm, the economy, and even the church. And he does this in myriad ways. He slips in Gibson Graham on the plural nature of capitalisms. He embraces consociationalism, or the plurality of associational political forms. And then, as he mentioned briefly before, he is keen on listening to the underside of history, which, as he says, often means finding a way to listen to those without an archive. In this political theology, there is a priority, not just a space, for the complexity and creativity of things like institution-based community organizing, worker justice centers, and immigrant rights collaboratives. Relatedly, conflict and conciliation are not errors or failures, but constitutive of the penultimate good of politics, part of the necessary process of building political solidarity of people. Democratic practices are messy matters that never eschew the grinding histories and realities of sin, the need for repentance, or the enduring theological hope we must embody politically. Animating this embrace of complexity and differentiated time, place, and associational forms is an astonishing array of theological resources. Although I'm tempted to talk about his compelling work on Pentecostalism, worship as class disruption, or his understanding of the Transfiguration, I want to highlight just one way in which Luke's work on secularity is particularly helpful for my own work. My most recent work ethnographically examines how Muslim low-wage worker activism in the United States reveals and challenges the supposed secular nature of the U.S. economy. U.S. economic arrangements are not merely empty of moral and even religious assumptions. Rather, certain forms of belief and practice are policed and expunged that do not align with forms of differentiation that sacralize efficiency and capital accumulation. The production line simply cannot stop for Muslim daily prayer. The supposed secularism of the economic realm is contested precisely when mostly Black and brown Muslim bodies require current economic practices to pause, realign, and respect the physical public practices of a faith that is very different than a particular strand of Christianity. Luke's development of a faithfully secular politics, or secularity, helps sharpen the necessary democratic counter to the current state and market-centric secularism that governs religion and actually inscribes and reifies damaging forms of Christian capitalism. Rather than secularism, Luke proposes secularity as, quote, a political good that serves the formation and sustaining of a common life amid difference, disagreement, and asymmetries of power. It entails a commitment to the formation of mutual rather than neutral ground. This approach embraces an historical understanding of the secular as that which is not eternity. The secular can certainly be incorporated, transfigured in eternity, but it is primarily about the here and now. It mixes the sacred and profane, and thus is always contingent and ambiguous. As he wonderfully notes, the secular is actually a gift, in that it is an opportunity to improvise forms of witness in response to the prior work of Christ and the Spirit. Secularist neutrality in the United States currently inscribes a value regime that not only harms non-Christian neighbors, but reinforces idolatrous forms of Christianity that constrain our moral and political imaginations and experimentations. Secularity invites us into mutual democratic engagement to construct our common lives with seeming strangers. Luke's vision provides a profound Christian grounding for robust multi-faith encounters that does not shy away from conflict and conciliation, and opens up more space for creative forms of multi-faith organizing rather than just privatized, apolitical forms of interfaith dialogue. I have more opinions about that if you want to hear that later. As Luke states early in his book, the prophetic no must be premised on some form of eschatological yes. This commitment shows throughout Christ in the Common Life and challenges me to deepen my own work. While there are places where I diverge or question choices in the text, his ethnographically haunted political theology of democratic politics continually invites me to think and acts in ways he names as bifocal, articulating the nature, form, and purpose of political life in light of the revelation of God given in Jesus Christ, while at the same time attending to the historical realities in which that life is lived. I am grateful for the challenge it offers me and the challenges and resources it will offer my students. Thank you, Luke.
Well, good evening. Great. I, too, come from a call and response tradition as well, so I'm glad to hear you respond. Thank you so much, Dr. Snarr, for those reflections. I must admit that when I knew I was going to be on the panel with you, I was a little kind of unnerved, and then with the additions of Dr. Coakley as well as Dr. Cavanaugh, I feel a little bit like the mule whose owner entered him into the Kentucky Derby. After the organizers of the event rejected the entry, one of the guys was so curious, he said, "Why did you do such a thing? You had to have known he wasn't going to win." The farmer responded by saying, "I figured as much, but I thought the mere association may do him some good." So to be associated with such an esteemed panel, I am truly grateful to be part of this conversation. And I want to begin as well by congratulating Luke on the publishing of his book, Christ and the Common Life. It is a significant contribution. I often tell him I'm not particularly a political theologian, but much of what he says in this particular book can certainly connect with the work that I do, especially in the realm of bioethics. I think some of the questions that I wrestle with respect to racial healthcare disparities, how forms of corrective justice need to become more important in our thinking of justice in terms of bioethics. One of the things that we try to do in this realm is try to push back on these notions of justice as being just distribution of burdens and benefits. But as Karen LeBax would often talk about as a liberation theologian, that theology and some of the resource in political theology will actually help us implode and explode the notions of justice, focusing on justice as a particular character trait that should form the way we approach these issues, and explode the notion of justice to look at systems and structures and how they contribute to creating some of the problems that we're trying to deal with in other ways in healthcare. And so Luke's resources that he's bringing to the table with respect to those issues have been extremely helpful to me, especially in that chapter on humanity, where he really raises the question of what does it mean to be human. Many of the problems that I see in bioethics is that we don't have a deep anthropology in which to do the work of bioethics. And so Luke is turning attention certainly to that. What I want to do this evening is, despite the many points of contact that I find in my own work with Christ in the Common Life that Luke has provided, I want to raise a question from social ethics, from the Black social gospel tradition, looking particularly at Martin Luther King Jr. One thing that particularly stuck out in my mind in reading the chapter on Black power is how someone like Martin Luther King Jr., qua political theologian, and as an advocate of a form of Black power, fits into the paradigm Luke helpfully articulates, expounds, and explicates in his work. In other words, I wonder whether King's political theology, insofar as I understand it and Luke's work, is in some tension with Luke's exposition of Black power as a case study in political theology. There are some narratives of the Black Power movement that would suggest that Black power was diametrically opposed to the work of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, while there are some fundamental differences between various expressions of Black power, others have acknowledged that King very well can be considered as advocating a form of Black power, especially with respect to the second phase of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King understood that power sources in American society were ideological economic, and political. He knew that the next major step was for African Americans to grasp these three levers of power, and he promoted concrete, color-conscious political programs for economic and racial justice for these ends. I would suggest we get significant aspects of this throughout King's book. Where do we go from here? Probably the more developed work in political theology that he develops. I'm thinking particularly in chapter 5, titled Where Are We Going? And the appendix there, Programs and Prospects, and also in King's article, Black Power Defined, that was published in 1967. Of course, there were marked differences between Dr. King and the new wave of African American nationalism that was being embraced by many in the community during the mid to late 1960s. Nevertheless, as Dr. King himself stated, that he embraced much of the basic political and social agenda of Black Power advocates. However, he strongly rejected the endorsement of what he thought would lead to retaliatory violence to which the movement was susceptible, and its advocacy of Black separatism. Related to this notion, I'm also curious as to how Luke may see Dr. King, qua political theologian and advocate of a form of Black power, relating to his conceptualization of Black nationalism's formation of a nation within a nation, which is a vital adjunct to dismantling white supremacy as a political system. Dr. King still seemed to hold out hope that American democratic values can be extended to enfranchise the disenfranchised, even though there seemed to be a growing sense of disillusionment in his mind near the end of his life. So is the American democratic project so shot through with white supremacy that to dismantle the latter is to dismantle the former? What is that relationship, and how might King be situated with respect to many of Luke's very thoughtful reflections here? And then lastly here, I'm just curious as to what Luke thinks about King's commitment to agape love as a political value, as a political virtue. He discusses very well in his book this notion of mutual reciprocity around hospitality in his work. And rightly or wrongly, King was advocating as part of a political project this notion of agape. This is where he was maybe picking up on some of Paul Ramsey's work, even though he diverged from Paul Ramsey in significant ways. But this idea of disinterested love of neighbor for her or his own sake, right? This notion of a non-reciprocal love. For King, agape was the only means that he could see that you could establish community where there previously was none. Acknowledge that there are all kinds of ways perhaps one can preserve community, but how might one create community where there previously was none? And so this notion of agape becomes very central as a political value for Dr. Martin Luther King's work here. And so how does this relate to the notion of mutual reciprocity around hospitality, given the dangers that are often had with thinking about agape in this kind of sacrificial way of thinking, how it continues to trample over the oppressed in so many ways? So just deeply appreciative of Luke's work, but these were some of the questions that I've chatted with him on prior occasions that I hope can further conversation. So I don't raise these primarily as criticisms, but just as constructive work that we would like to have with him in these matters. So thank you so much, Luke, for your work in this, and I'm sure it will continue to generate conversation as we teach our classes and continue to wrestle with these issues of what it means to do life together and love our neighbors.
Luke, I invite you to respond.
First of all, thank you. Just wonderful, rich responses, and always an honor to be in conversation with Melissa and Patrick. The joy of having Patrick is he's just down the corridor now, so I can keep the conversation going. So I think just quickly to Melissa, I think that you're right. It is ethnographically haunted, and I think that you've picked up on and articulated very clearly a central aim of the conception of secularity, which is precisely to allow for those kinds of multi-faith and other forms of faith, political action, but but for Christians to understand there is a theological basis for receiving that as a gift, not as a threat, which is so often both in the UK and over here, and where the attention is too often directed in the wrong way, as so often happens in our politics. The enemy is seen to be some minoritized other, rather than the ways in which there are real exploitations and oppressions going on in the marketplace or by the state. And so certainly that echoes, as you know, my experience in the London context, working with London citizens, where it wasn't the kind of highbrow, neutral, liberal secularists who were working for the better wages of low-wage Muslim women. It was Pentecostals, it was Catholics, it was Hindu priests. It was a strange world I entered of folk who understood that religion and politics didn't always equal violence. It could actually generate love and justice. Yes, that's key. And I think that sense of how we keep in play a keen eye on the need for hope while wrestling with the realities of the complexity of politics that discipline our inevitable tendency to be self-righteous vanguards who think they can do no wrong. That's always the battle. I think we have similar students. I'm not saying anything. So Patrick, that's fantastic response. When we first talked about this, I thought, oh, gracious, yes, King, I haven't. But partly, as you know, particularly the chapter on Black Power is partly in response to a huge emphasis on the civil rights movement and Kings, particularly amongst white theologians. And so the importance with focusing on Black Power, which is often told as a declension narrative. There's numerous books which do this. We have the heights of the civil rights movement, of the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and then it all goes downhill after there. And I just wasn't buying that. And then often the conflation and misunderstanding around advocacy of self-defense that you get in something like the Black Panther Party, and prior to that in things like the Deacons of Defense, and the conflation of that with the proactive use of violence for political ends, so the turn to beatings, kidnappings, etc., to achieve political purposes. And through, as you know in the chapter, the ways in which the strong advocacy of self-defense there wasn't a taking up, as there were parallels at the time, like the Baader-Meinhof or the IRA. There were plenty of revolutionary movements who turned to violence for a proactive end, for proactive political purposes. That was a tiny group. The Black Liberation Army made that move. It was like 50, 60, but it was a tiny group of people, a parallel with the Weathermen Underground. But by 72, in a big national convention in Cleveland, the move was to what kind of democratic politics was available. And I think that's where you have the strong connection between King, the later King, and the debates that emerge in the Black Power movement. And it seems to me there's a big, the big kind of analytical question you raised is one where King thought that America was an essentially just system acting unjustly, and therefore could be redeemed in some way, could be called back to its true purposes. Malcolm X, obviously Stokely Carmichael, Elroy Cleaver, many others, thought that America was much more parallel to South Africa or Angola at the time, i.e. a settler colonial state, which was basically had to be resisted. But even if they had that analysis, the move was not to proactive use of violence. It was to some form of radical democracy, like King. And I think that's exactly where you have the meetup with King. And then the question is, what kind of radical democracy? Is it radical economic cooperatives? Is it, as Albert Clegg in Detroit developed, a whole array of all alternative institutions, which meant, this is what it meant to be a nation within a nation. But I think we see parallel moves, paradoxically, going on all over the place. We can think of Stanley's own work and advocacy of communities of character, not bound into the state and market. So I think there are interesting parallels here that aren't often made if one really pays attention to what's going on in the Black Power debates. And what does it mean to be a nation within a nation, i.e., what does it mean to be resident aliens, if one can draw a parallel, is the same question that is faced by the church. And it's the question of Exodus. How do you form a people who are fundamentally shaped by structures of oppression to be a people who know how to live freely amidst ongoing structures of oppression? And as with Exodus, there's a huge range. Is it education? Is it worship? Is it forming independent enclaves where you can hold power to determine your own affairs? There's a huge range of all these things. But I would say in all of them, there's not a turn to the active use of violence to achieve political ends. Now, that, I think, then brings us to the question of King as a political theologian and his advocacy of love. So I do make a strong case in the book for a kind of more mutualist, reciprocal conception of love. It is absolutely a place for agape and sacrifice. But I think in the church, we've too often made that the goal rather than the means. So, and I do understand King in that sense. You cannot make sacrifice the goal. If sacrifice is the goal, then it's about a total sacrifice and destruction. And Dolores Williams and others draw out the critique of that. It's rather, for certain people, the call is to make that sacrifice as a catalyst to make possible the possibilities of communion or the possibilities of a more mutual reciprocal life beyond that. Because ultimately, in Christian terms, the goal is not endless crucifixion. It's communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I think that must be the guiding light of why, at certain times, in certain places, for certain people, a kind of self-emptying, kenotic love becomes possible, becomes necessary in order to generate richer possibilities of communion. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Melissa and Patrick, for your responses. Bill, I want to turn to you and broaden the horizon a bit. You got your work now as a leading political theologian, but really got your start focused in a different political context, namely Pinochet's Chile, and a different theological orientation around understandings within the Catholic tradition. I wonder how you're hearing this conversation in the light of what a Catholic imagination in Pinochet's Chile and questions of democracy and Christ in a common life look like in the light of that trajectory that you've been developing in political theology.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. This is. I was telling Steve on the way over, Steve Long, that I was really looking forward to going to a conference where I didn't have to say anything, and instead I find myself here where I don't have anything to say. But Luke's work has been really compelling to me. I mean, in some ways, I think that Luke is a bridge between the kind of work on the church that I've been undertaking under Stanley's influence and public theology, a kind of bridging. I guess Luke is who I would be if I had more social skills. He's kind of, that's the way I would like to write things. But a different sort of context, really. I mean, under Pinochet's regime, there was a way in which there are certain kind of constitutive elements of being Catholic that are sacramental, that then get forced into a mode of resistance. And it's interesting to me that so what I tried to do is again kind of ethnographic in the same way that Luke has done, and look at the actual practices of the church on the ground in Chile and develop a kind of sacramental theology, see how sacramental theology develops under those circumstances. And so torture, the atomization of the body politic, Eucharist as the kind of reconstituting of the body politic. It's interesting to me, though, that what's happened in Chile over the last 20 years has been a really sad story, and in part because the church has kind of fallen apart in Chile in the intervening years. In part, it's because of the sexual abuse scandal, but in some ways, it's also in part it's because of the ordeal of living under kind of fairly democratic and prosperous kind of reign. And there's I mean, this question that you were just talking about, Luke, I thought was really interesting. How this Exodus question of how you develop practices under circumstances of oppression, and in some ways that's the easier part, right? I mean, in some ways that the church in Chile knew what it was doing under Pinochet, and now kind of doesn't know what it's doing. And this has been really interesting to me because kind of autobiographically, this is kind of where I find myself in the Catholic Church as well, coming out of this situation where you've got really constitutive practices like weekly confession and so on, and watching that kind of fall apart. And then what do you do under those kinds of circumstances? I mean, Melissa's example is about the Muslim practices that the assembly line can't accommodate practices of prayer. I'm just wondering, Catholics used to be under in that sort of situation as well, and are not. We used to have undigestible practices, and now largely we don't. And I mean, there might be some parallels with the Black Church as well. And so all of the stuff that you're doing on difference, I think, is really important and really good. Part of the question is then, what do you do when you don't have enough differences where you've got communities of practice where you even have anything to kind of grab onto, and that's part of the issue I think that we're facing now, is that these kind of practices are falling away and being homogenized, and that in some ways is more of an ordeal. No, I don't want to say that it's not more of an ordeal. It's just a different kind of ordeal under these kinds of circumstances. So I find myself in a church that's falling apart, and trying to kind of find practices that can sustain us. And they obviously have to be different kinds of practices. But those are the kinds of questions that I think you're grappling with in a different sort of way as well. But that's I guess that's where I'd find the connection with. Yeah.
So it's just one quick. I think that is a very the kind of issue of sustaining faithful witness and cultivating people capable of making the kinds of judgments that aren't wholly determined by market or state logics. Is just a deep challenge. Particularly under the kind of economic pressures, both just the need to put bread on the table, and then also the seductions of the kind of consumer lifestyle as offering a kind of false theodicy. This will solve your problem of suffering, but it never does. But I think within that, then, the kinds of multi-faith coalitional work that Melissa's work points to, and some of the work I did before in London, I think that, to give one concrete example, when we were looking at practices of debt and consumer credit cards and unsecured loans, and the whole question of debt, which is such a driver. I mean, everyone here has got student loans and the rest. We know the realities of debt and debt bondage, but for particularly when you're not paid enough and you require debt to literally get by to the end of the week, there was a huge issue there. And of course, as a Christian and talking amongst the Christians, we didn't really have anything to say about debt. We'd totally lost our practices of anti-usury kind of mindset and our practices of thinking about that. I'd never thought theologically about debt, even though I had a mortgage, I was immersed in the stuff. And it was the encounter with Muslims who turns out had a lot to say about debt. And that forced a kind of, for me personally, set of theological questions about what do we think. But it was interesting with the clergy and other leaders, really a reckoning with their unmindful acceptance of debt regimes, which they came to realize through the encounter with the Muslims were deeply un-Christian, and they're just taken as the water they swam in. And so I think that kind of encounter with difference, which precisely a kind of secularity offers the gift of, but the trouble is we so often then see the other as the threat, particularly the religious other, and turn to, horror of horrors, the very processes of consumerism and the state to protect ourselves from seemingly the opportunity of recovering our own faith.
Yeah, that's one of the really wonderful things about your work is that you recognize that the gifts that the Muslims, for example, have to give us is both a gift from them and a gift that kind of helps us recover the best of our own faith. So thanks for that.
Thanks. Sarah, you come to this conversation from an allied field, more as a systematic theologian, although one who has written powerfully about your experience in prisons and mental health institutions and very complicated environments around agency and those sorts of questions. What do you hear in all of this?
Well, thanks so much for the honor of being invited at short notice to add my little penny's worth. And even those of you who have not yet read Luke's book will probably be aware how significant a venture this book is at a time of such really worrying fragmentation, massive inequality, potential violence, and I think the greatest threats to our Western democratic future that I've known in my lifetime at present. And I merely wish to offer 3 little comments which may open up onto conversations tomorrow as well, because I've had the pleasure of reading in the last 48 hours the excellent 4 contrapuntal interventions that we're going to hear tomorrow. So my 3 comments are these. First, one of the features that is remarkable about Luke's work is that he is absolutely unafraid to be robustly theological in a discussion which in America is squeamish about being theological when we talk about processes of democracy in the supposed separation of church and state. And of course, he doesn't talk about this very much, but the reason he does this is that he's British. And the influence on him is more Richard Hooker, probably, than Emerson, right? And I do think that this deserves more attention because it is the political context in which we speak about the relationship between theology and politics that gives us permission or not to introduce robustly theological content, or whether, on the contrary, we feel that we must dilute it. And I noticed in at least 2 of the contrapuntal papers for tomorrow, Jennifer Hertz's paper and Jonathan Tran's paper, an emphasis on how you would not be able to make the suggestions you did without, on the one hand, a very well-developed pneumatology, and on the other hand, a strong emphasis on the virtue of hope, an undervalued virtue. So I hope we'll keep this in play tomorrow, because I think that's one of the main things that your book propels us to think about afresh in the American context. Secondly, several people have already talked about practices, and those of you who know my systematic theological work know that I attempt to keep spiritual practice, especially contemplation, and theology tightly together. But I wonder whether emphasizing only the necessity to hear is sufficient, because in a society of endemic and systemic racism, one might more truly say that what we lack is the capacity to see. And I think, therefore, that practices which concentrate only on one of the senses are insufficient. And practices which concentrate only on things we might like to add to our favorite leisure pursuits are also insufficient, because any practices that are really going to affect change in our current emergency situation are going to be extremely discomforting. And so I ask, how discomforting would they need to be, and what form would they need to take radically to change not only those who are privileged, but also, dare I say it, those who are stuck in a position of underprivilege? That's what's so challenging, I think. And the third point relates to that as a sort of codicil and links onto Vincent Lloyd's remarkable little paper for tomorrow, which is on anger, which you also attack at points in your book. And the one thing that Vincent, interestingly, doesn't really tackle in a marvelous typologizing of different approaches to anger in the modern period is that tradition which ultimately comes out of Plato's Phaedrus, but then gets taken on by the early Greek fathers, Gregory of Nyssa and Evagrius particularly, and is developed in Maximus. And that is the idea that anger can be metabolized. In other words, anger as a dark force is capable of being transformed into love, as Maximus the Confessor puts it, but only under certain conditions of disciplined transformation in contemplation, sacramental practice, service to the poor, and so on and so forth. So I think focusing on anger as a spiritual challenge is enormously significant for your particular undertaking. And we must be grateful to Vincent for raising this as a central theme in contemporary political theology. But I hope that by the end of this weekend we'll be able to say more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Luke, do you want to respond to Sarah's reflections?
Just quickly on the anger and hearing side, I'm not sure seeing is. I'm trying to kind of decenter seeing. I think we're very focused on seeing.
Do we do it well?
That's true, but I think the kind of the ways in which seeing things, we presume that we've got them in a certain way. Hearing is a much more destabilizing way of encountering the world, I think, and we're not always clear what we're hearing, and even in words we understand, the kind of mumbling is you can't quite make out what's going on. You can't determine, you can't kind of pre-package or predetermine what is being heard in a way in which I can just shut my eyes and shut out. It's harder to shut sound out. And I think there's a way in which hearing and sound push us beyond kind of cognitive, what is kind of cognitive processing. We had in our house flying squirrels in the attic. I am going somewhere with this, I promise you. And there's a sense in which when you have a sound that's kind of lies beyond, you can't. There's a great word called acousmatic, and it means sound you can't identify where it comes from. And squirrels in the attic are acousmatic sound, and they drive you crazy. Or mice in the walls. Kafka has a great story on this, where he's got mice in the walls. The sense in which it totally drills into your consciousness, and you can't control it, and yet it's present to you. And I think there's ways in which, if we're truly going to kind of hear the world, engage the world around us, the cries of the poor, the cries of those on the underside of history, wrestling with what things like the Atlantic slave trade or the Holocaust represent to us, they're a kind of, we can't always name or grasp or wrestle them into some comprehensible meaning or form in a way in which I think that often goes on with the visual. They force upon us a sense in which we don't understand, we don't control. They force upon us a certain humility before them in a way which I think is very important for understanding the world around us, not as a platform on which we impose our meanings, but a cosmos we participate in and that lies beyond our grasp and beyond our ability to determine its meaning. And I think that is the bigger and richer problem that we're confronted with. Pope Francis has a great take on this in Laudato Si, in what he calls the technocratic paradigm. But that sense in which, how do we not understand the world around us as if I can impose my will upon it and grasp it to do with it what I will, but accept it as a gift that I have to participate in, and therefore not be in control, not understanding, not being able to make sense of, but have to encounter others in that process to try and develop some kind of shared meaning in the face of whether it's horrendous evil or the simple wonder of the world around us. And I think that is where your work wonderfully points in this direction. I think, and it's a lovely phrase I learned from Mary Fulkerson, that theology either takes place at the site of a wound or at a place of wonder. And there's lots of rich theology that takes place at the site of wonder and awe, but both wounds and the places of wonder are places of bewilderment, where you don't understand. And that's why I do think hearing and sound is actually important. It points to quite significant modes of how we are rightly orientated to reality.
Thanks. In just a moment, we're going to open up for questions from the audience. But before that, I want to ask the four panelists to offer some reflections in which Luke gets to listen. All of you had different comments about what it would mean to form people capable of contributing to a common life in a way that attends to virtues such as humility and justice and other sorts of practices. I want you to reflect on what it would take to form such people, and perhaps a brief example of somewhere where you find a site of hope in the midst of the fragmentation and polarization that afflicts us these days. And you don't have to go in order, so anyone can begin. But what would it take to form people, and where's a site that gives you hope for that currently?
The two most effective things I do pedagogically with undergraduates are a course I teach where I do Augustine through consumer behavior, and we have a 3-week experiment in asceticism, which is voluntary, but the students and I, about half of the students and I usually do it together. No meat, no alcohol, no sugar, no sex, no tobacco, no internet, etc. For
how long?
3 weeks. And for the students that survive it, it's formative. It's formative for me as well. So there's something about asceticism, I think, that brings us back to a certain place. The other thing, I teach a course on immigrant Catholicism in Chicago, and we spend a week going out to churches, a Polish Catholic church and a Chinese Catholic church and an African American Catholic church and Mexican and Irish and so on. And there's something about being in the neighborhoods, talking to people, walking in and hearing them gasp as they see the Baroque riot going on in the Polish church. There's something about the beauty of it that and the walking and the very physicality of it that I think is formative. So paradoxically, asceticism and beauty would be the two places that I would go for formative practices that are hopeful.
I guess I would say it's kind of an obvious answer, but it's true, right? In terms of the way I think about this, I think being a product of the Black church, understood in a very multifaceted way, and taking seriously African American Christian experience in particular, that the church in that particular space of worship and community is particularly important, I think, when it's done right in terms of formation of particular types of virtues that are needed given the kind of fragmented world that we live in, that can also continue to nurture a sign of hope in particular ways. One of the things I'm struck by is in certain spaces when we are bringing young people in as they're wrestling with some of the issues that they are confronting, as we're looking at national kinds of issues and political disenfranchisement. It's sad, but it can also be reassuring in many ways that we remind each other that we've been here before, right? That in many ways that God has seen God's people through, and that God will continue to see God's people through as we continue to maintain faith and to look to a particular vision that continues to reinforce these notions of hope that I think is deeply embedded in these traditions. A sense of realism, yes, recognizing that the struggles continue, but also a profound strength for those who've gone before us, and as we continue to think about these issues. So this notion of worship, I think, in these spaces becomes really, really important. And also, I think something about the Black homiletical tradition is really important. When I think about this notion, this ancient discipline of rhetoric, right, that is often needed during times of cultural upheaval, right? That there's something about the patterns of speech that resonate in a particular way with the heartstrings. So it's, yes, there has to be substance, something that has some type of cognitive oomph to it, but there's also something that needs to resonate with the heart in a particular way that can sustain one from day to day. And I think this distinctive of the diversity of kind of Black preaching, this Black homiletical tradition as a form of rhetoric during cultural upheaval is a way of ongoingly forming individuals. And so that's, I think, my answer to that question that you raised, Greg.
So I'm technically on parental leave right now, and I'm with an infant. So my brain barely worked for this presentation today. But it has, one answer to this question is that it has forced me into conversations about the everydayness of formation. What I do with, do I argue with my wife in front of my child? How do we mutually discipline each other in the family? Where are my fears from the trauma, personally, politically, culturally? What school is he going to go to? How is my child going to embody a presence in the community that we live in, and in the economic inequality? The everydayness of the listening to the tough questions of my 3-year-old, and then what my 7-8-month-old is absorbing is a starting place. And it's forced me to go back to things that I have thought so structurally for so long, that those intimacies, the intimacies of formation, are really powerful for me right now. But the other thing that is a place of formation, and maybe where I see this happening, Nashville is a very interesting place. We have the largest Kurdish community in the entire nation. And where I see hopes of formation for the kind of democratic politics that Luke points towards is in the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, where they're pulling together folks from multiple faiths who have incredible personal and political traumas. And they're having to vote on who their member leadership is. How does the Somali Muslim and the Ethiopian Christian get over years of conflict to not vote just on ethnic lines? How do we make a statement on Trump's, anyway, relationship to the Kurdish crisis right now? What's the nature of the organization? to see that community navigate, that is the sacred secularity. And that's where I want to be ethnographically haunted for what it means to do this work.
Well, those of you who know my work will be aware that I make this constant controversial claim that the most important formational activity is learning attentive silence, and not as a magic bullet, not as a Pelagian activity, but as a transforming practice, which I agree affects how you hear, but I also would want to argue strongly affects how you see by blacking out a great deal of what you think you see. So I don't think any of the answers are ones I would want to dispute, but I think that I have found for myself that this is the practice that really shakes me to the roots.
Luke, do you have an example?
No, I'll leave it. They're just beautiful.
Let me open up to questions from the audience. There's a microphone toward the back. So if you could bring the microphone, there's one question up here just so everyone can hear the question. And we have a second one right behind there.
Say your name and where you're from.
Say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Sam Schmidt. I'm a Ph.D. student at UNC of all places. Sorry. Yeah, so this is what I see as two interrelated questions. So this sounds like quite hard. And if you think that a lot of American Christianity is spiritually flabby, how realistic is this approach? Second, and I say, I think it's interrelated. What does your approach imply about the speed, scale, and distance that's involved in being engaged in a common life with people? So how fast does your common life move? How big is your common life community? How far do you have to drive to be a part of it? It sounds like it's a little mundane, but I think it's a real question. Thanks.
So thanks, Sam. As ever, on point. So yeah, I mean, I think the challenge, in a sense, I don't think the church has ever been good. So like, you know, American Christianity is its own version of ungood Christianity. We've had many others. It's not a new thing. So the challenge of Reformation is ever there. What's the task of theology? To lay out a compelling vision that is a nourishing one, that perhaps people can kind of see how the fears that drive flabby forms or ungood forms aren't really to be so feared, and that what they think of as good forms might well be sources of toxicity. Now, that's always a challenge, I think, before us. I teach at a divinity school. We're training clergy and pastors and those engaged in the mission and ministry of the church. And that's a challenge for them on the ground. And the kinds of practices which have just been laid out, I think, with enormous care and beauty, I think are precisely part of what one's inviting people to engage in. And that's what kind of church leaders are about, but not just church leaders. I think ordinary Christians often have a better idea of this than those who run the institutions they go to on a Sunday. In terms of the scale, I think I don't think it's just a question of the local against the global. That's often, there's a kind of baptism of the local. I live in Durham. There's a strong sense in which it's kind of artisanal with everything, as if like bespoke beer and a meadery is going to save you from the depredations of consumer capitalism. It isn't. Some might say it's a kind of form of consumer nostalgia, but I'll leave it there. So I think it's much more thinking about, Saskia Sassen has a great line about locality being a micro environment with a global scale, with global circuits. Take the Duke Duke is shot through with global circuits. So there is something about proximity, but proximity can be operating at many levels simultaneously. And so, again, unhooking ourselves from a kind of scalar imagination, which is in political terms, is often what's the effective scale of action? Is it the local? Is it the national? Is it the global? And whether it's socialism, environmentalism, it's always the debate about what's the scale of action. I think that's a misunderstanding, and I'll just talk here about political action rather than about common life more broadly. But in terms of political action, I think we have to be much more attentive to strategic interventions that are time and place specific. Politics is always action in time, but we're often not good in our analysis about who we're going to act with or against, where and when. And so a good example is the Centre for Responsible Lending here in Durham is part of Self-Help, which is the largest credit union in America. They have 3 offices to think about getting strategic intervention around banks to do with responsible lending, particularly to marginalized communities. They have an office here because it's historically the base, an office in DC to keep an eye on national policy, but the main office is in California. And when I asked them, why is it in California, is because in their analysis of all lending policies to do with housing, since 1945, because of the way the housing market operated, they were all developed in California and then rolled to the East Coast across America from there. So if they can change banking policies in California, they've changed America and probably the world. So that's an analysis which says you don't have to go to DC and operate at the national level as the only effective scale, or go to the World Bank. You can have some strategic interventions that can have had profound impacts, but you don't imagine that because our political imaginaries, as I think Bill's work is very key in agitating us around, our political imaginaries is hooked into the nation state as the only form. And then our reaction against that, somehow the local is what saves us from that. And I just think that's the wrong way of thinking about the problem.
Mm-hmm. Bill, do you want any comment on that?
No. No, I agree. I mean, what Luke put it beautifully. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Nimi Waraboko from Boston University. I found the discussion between Sarah and Luke about hearing and listening very interesting. But what is unsaid about it is that the debate goes to the root of, Western thought and system. In the West, because once you look at the debate between them in terms of oral society, like where I grew up, to understand is to hear in almost all African language. But in the West, to understand is to, did you see the point? So, and this was not always so. I've had lawyers, actually legal scholars, look at this issue of and tracing at what point in the history of the West understanding came to be associated with seeing rather than with hearing. And so in oral society, to understand, or in Africa, the word to understand is, so did you hear the point? So in the West, even our legal system do not accept hearsay. It only accepts eyewitness. So there are emphasis in the system that takes out every form of this. So my question is not whether theology should be about hearing or seeing, but how can theology be heard, be smelled, be tasted, be touched, so that you include the 5 senses? Because like law in African society, all the 5 senses are involved in the way law is understood and administered. So why can't theology on the larger scale, why should it be limited to hearing or the debate about seeing, but why can't all the, like you said, 5 senses, how will that change the way we understand political theology or the common life?
Sarah?
Superb. I mean, you probably know that Gregory of Nyssa, in his late work, sort of toppled the hegemony of Aristotle's assertion that sight is the most closely related to the mind by insisting that sight and hearing have to be darkened in order for these other three senses to come into their own in Christ. So I would say that practices of attention that radically reformulate all our senses. But the West has definitely prioritized sight. But to that, of course, Luther was a reaction. So it's been an interesting contrapuntal history, but one which I think generally has given much less place to the other three.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think you're exactly right, Nimi. I think it's what would a kind of understanding, if we understand reality as participated in rather than grasped, and therefore the ways we are extended beyond ourselves through smell, touch, see, taste, and how then, particularly if you think about taste, which is incredibly powerful. My wonderful wife's a chef, so it becomes very important in my life, and smell connected to that. But how in those kinds of senses, you're inherently related to others, and not just through sight, which is a sense of distance, but through taste and smell, the relational practices which make that food possible are you are literally ingesting someone else's work, and you're kind of conscious of that. So I think the ways in which we do need to understand our participation in reality through a kind of full sensorium of all the senses, and that when we're describing realities, I try to, in a sense, in the book, intentionally try and use language that speaks to multiple senses. And again, so I think that's absolutely vital. What that then also means for a notion of a common life, and who has agency in contributing to its upbuilding. It's not just those who can speak, not just those who can see accurately, but the other kinds of senses come into play, and therefore how we imagine agency in working together, I think is a really exciting way of opening things up.
That's perhaps an appropriate note to turn our attention now to a reception and then dinner where we can indulge some of the other senses besides hearing and sight. So would you join me in thanking Luke and our panel for this conversation?
Book purchasing and signing through that door.